I'll create a new script following the exact same pattern and style. Dean Martin stopped his concert mid-song when he saw a janitor crying in the back. Dean Martin stopped singing, mid-verse, middle of Everybody Loves Somebody. The orchestra was still playing. The audience of 1,200 people at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas was still swaying, but Dean had stopped. He set the microphone back in its stand, walked off stage, didn't say a word to the conductor, didn't acknowledge the confused murmuring from the crowd. He walked straight to the back of the showroom, where a 62-year-old janitor named Robert Hayes was standing against the wall, tears streaming down his face. Dean put his hand on the old man's shoulder. "What's wrong?" The orchestra trailed off. The crowd went silent. Frank Sinatra, sitting at a table in the front, leaned forward, trying to see what was happening. What happened next lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes that cost Dean $15,000 in refunds and made the Riviera's general manager threaten to sue. But it taught everyone in that room something about what it means to see people, really see them. Not the famous ones, not the wealthy ones, the invisible ones. Las Vegas, Nevada, Saturday night, June 14, 1969. Robert Hayes had worked as a janitor at the Riviera Hotel for 11 years. He started in 1958, a year after the hotel opened. He was 51 years old then, newly widowed, raising 3 kids alone. His wife, Dorothy, had died of leukemia, 49 years old. They'd been married 28 years. The medical bills had destroyed them financially. Even with insurance, they'd owed $8,000. Robert had sold their house, sold their car, sold everything except the clothes they wore. He'd moved the kids, Robert Jr., age 16, Michelle, age 14, and Thomas, age 11, into a 2-bedroom apartment in North Las Vegas. He'd taken the janitor job because it paid $1.85 an hour and came with health insurance. For 11 years, he'd worked the night shift, 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., 6 days a week. He cleaned the showrooms after performances, emptied trash cans, mopped floors, scrubbed bathrooms. He was invisible. Hotel guests walked past him without seeing him. Performers never acknowledged him. Management barely remembered his name. Robert didn't mind. He had his kids, he had his dignity, he had work. But on June 14, 1969, something happened that broke Robert Hayes in a way that 11 years of invisible labor never had. His daughter, Michelle, had gotten accepted to UCLA, full academic scholarship. She was brilliant, straight A's, valedictorian of her high school class, accepted to 6 universities. UCLA had offered her a full ride, tuition, room, board, books, everything. Except one thing. The acceptance letter included a list of additional required expenses: dorm supplies, transportation to and from campus, a mandatory freshman orientation trip that cost $350, personal expenses estimated at $200 per semester. Total, approximately $1,000 before she could even start. Robert had been saving. For 11 years, he'd been putting away $10 per week, sometimes more if he got overtime. He had $4,200 in a savings account at Valley Bank. It was enough, just barely. He'd planned to give Michelle $1,000 for her college expenses and keep the rest for emergencies, for Robert Jr.'s community college tuition next year, for Thomas when his time came. But 2 days ago, on Thursday, June 12th, Valley Bank had collapsed. It wasn't a big bank, just a local institution that served North Las Vegas residents, mostly working-class folks who couldn't meet the minimum balance requirements at the larger banks. Valley Bank had made bad investments. The FDIC would eventually sort it out, return some percentage of deposits, but that would take months, maybe years. Robert's $4,200 was gone, just gone. He'd gone to the bank on Friday morning, stood in line with dozens of other people, all of them panicking, all of them demanding their money. A bank manager, a young man in a cheap suit, had told him, "We're working with federal regulators. You'll get a portion of your deposits back, probably 40 to 60 cents on the dollar, but it's going to take some time." How much time? 6 months, maybe a year. Michelle was supposed to leave for UCLA in 10 weeks. Robert had gone home and told his daughter, watched her face try to stay brave, watched her say, "It's okay, Dad, I can defer for a year, I can work, save up." But Robert knew what that meant. A year working in Las Vegas when you're 18 years old, when you're brilliant and supposed to be at UCLA, that year can become 2 years, then 5, then forever. The city had a way of swallowing dreams. So tonight, Saturday, June 14, 1969, Robert Hayes had come to work at the Riviera like always. He'd brought his cleaning cart, he'd emptied trash cans in the casino, mopped floors in the restaurant, and at 10:30 p.m. he'd pushed his cart into the showroom where Dean Martin was performing, the second show of the night. He was supposed to wait until the show ended to clean, but he needed to replace the trash liners in the back, a job that wouldn't disturb anyone. He'd stood against the back wall, in the shadows where the lights didn't reach, and listened to Dean Martin sing. Dean was singing "Everybody Loves Somebody," the song that had knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot in 1964, the song that had become Dean's signature. Robert had heard it 100 times. He'd cleaned this showroom while Dean performed dozens of shows, but tonight the lyrics hit differently. Everybody loves somebody sometime. Everybody falls in love somehow. Robert thought about his wife, Dorothy, about how she used to sing while cooking dinner, about how she danced with him in their tiny kitchen the night they'd bought their first house, about how she'd made him promise, right before she died, that he'd make sure the kids got educated, that he'd give them opportunities she'd never had. He'd kept that promise for 11 years, worked 6 days a week, skipped meals to save money, wore the same 4 shirts in rotation. And now, 2 days before his daughter was supposed to confirm her acceptance to UCLA, he couldn't keep his promise. The tears started slowly, then he couldn't stop them. A 62-year-old janitor standing in the shadows at the back of a Las Vegas showroom, crying while Dean Martin sang about love. Dean saw him. Most performers didn't look at the back of the room. They focused on the front tables, the VIPs, the big tippers. The lights were positioned to make everything beyond the 10th row disappear into darkness. But Dean had always paid attention to the whole room, the cheap seats, the back corners, the places where the invisible people stood. He'd been one of those invisible people once, working for $15 a night in clubs that didn't even put his name on the marquee. So he noticed when the janitor in the back started crying. At first, Dean thought maybe the old man was having a medical emergency. But no, he was standing upright, leaning against the wall, just crying. Something was wrong. Dean stopped singing, set the microphone back in its stand. The orchestra kept playing for a few more bars before trailing off into confused silence. The audience stirred. This wasn't part of the show. Dean walked off stage, not to the wings, straight down the steps, into the audience, walking toward the back of the room. People started murmuring. What was happening? Was something wrong? Frank Sinatra, sitting at his usual front table with a scotch and a cigarette, sat up straight. He knew Dean. When Dean broke routine, something important was happening. Dean reached the back wall where Robert Hayes was standing, trying desperately to wipe his eyes, mortified that he'd been noticed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Martin," Robert stammered. "I'm sorry, I'll leave. I didn't mean to—" Dean put his hand on the old man's shoulder. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, sir. I'm fine. I'm just—" "You're not fine," Dean said gently. "What happened?" The entire showroom was watching now, 1,200 people, silent, trying to figure out what was happening in the shadows at the back. Robert couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. Dean guided him to a chair against the wall, the kind of folding chair the staff used during their breaks. He sat Robert down, then Dean pulled over another chair and sat next to him. The audience couldn't hear what they were saying.
The conversation was private, quiet, just two men talking. But they could see Dean listening, really listening, nodding, asking questions, his hand still on the old man's shoulder. This went on for 7 minutes. 7 minutes while 1,200 people sat in silence. 7 minutes while the orchestra waited. 7 minutes while Frank Sinatra watched his friend talk to a janitor instead of finishing the show. Finally, Dean stood up. He pulled out his wallet. He handed Robert something, the audience couldn't see what. Then he shook Robert's hand, squeezed his shoulder one more time, and walked back to the stage. He picked up the microphone. "Sorry about that, folks," Dean said, his voice back to its usual casual tone. "Where were we?" The orchestra started up again. Dean finished Everybody Loves Somebody. Then he did That's Amore, Ain't That a Kick in the Head, 3 more songs. When the show ended at 11:45 p.m., the general manager of the Riviera, a man named Carl Peterson, was waiting backstage. "What the hell was that?" Peterson demanded. "What was what?" Dean asked, lighting a cigarette. "You stopped the show for 7 minutes. People are asking for refunds." "Give them refunds." "Do you know how much that's going to cost?" "I don't really care, Carl." Peterson's face was red. "You had 1,200 people waiting while you talked to a janitor. A janitor, Dean." Dean looked at Peterson. The casual amusement left his face. His voice stayed quiet, but there was steel underneath. "His name is Robert Hayes. He's worked here for 11 years, and he was crying because his daughter got into UCLA, but he can't afford to send her because Valley Bank collapsed and took his life savings." Peterson stared. So I stopped the show, I talked to him, I wrote him a check for $5,000, and now his daughter can go to UCLA. You gave a janitor $5,000? I gave Robert $5,000, yes. That's not your responsibility. Dean took a long drag from his cigarette. "Carl, I make $50,000 a week performing in your hotel. Robert makes $1.85 an hour cleaning up after people like me. His daughter is brilliant, got a full scholarship to UCLA, and the only thing standing between her and that education was $1,000 in expenses that he'd saved for 11 years until his bank collapsed 2 days ago." He stubbed out the cigarette. "So yeah, I stopped the show, I talked to him, I gave him money. And if people want refunds because they had to wait 7 minutes, give them refunds. I'll cover it." Peterson opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "This is bad for business, Dean." "Then don't book me anymore."
Dean walked past him to his dressing room. Robert Hayes sat in that folding chair for 20 minutes after Dean went back on stage. He was holding a check for $5,000. $5,000, more money than he made in 3 years of cleaning floors. In Dean's handwriting, the memo line said, "For Michelle's education." The stage manager, a woman named Diane who'd worked at the Riviera for 8 years, came over. "Robert, are you okay?" He looked up at her. "He gave me $5,000. "I know, I saw." "Why would he do that? He doesn't know me." Diane smiled. "That's Dean. He pays attention to people. All people, not just the famous ones." She helped Robert to his feet. "You should probably go home," she said gently. "I'll cover your stations tonight. Go tell your daughter the good news." Robert drove home in a daze. He parked his car in front of his apartment building at 12:30 a.m. The lights were still on. Michelle was probably studying. She always studied late. He walked in. Michelle was at the kitchen table, books spread everywhere, working on a summer reading assignment for UCLA, even though she wasn't sure she could go. "Dad, you're home early." Robert couldn't speak. He just handed her the check. Michelle looked at it, looked at her father, looked at the check again. "What is this?" "Dean Martin gave it to me." "What? Why?" "Because he saw me crying, and he asked me why, and I told him about UCLA, about the bank, about—" Robert's voice broke. "About your mother's promise." Michelle started crying. "Dad!" "You're going to UCLA," Robert said. "You're going, and you're going to be brilliant, and your mother would be so proud." They stood in that tiny kitchen and held each other and cried. The next morning, the Las Vegas Review-Journal ran a story. Dean Martin stops show to help Riviera janitor. The article included quotes from audience members. Some were annoyed about the interruption. Some were confused, but most were moved. "I paid $25 to see Dean Martin sing. What I got was a reminder that kindness matters more than entertainment." The Riviera received 47 requests for refunds. Dean wrote a check to cover all of them, $1,175. He also wrote a letter to Carl Peterson. "Carl, if people are upset that I stopped the show to help someone who needed it, they can have their money back, but I'm not apologizing. Robert Hayes has worked for you for 11 years. He makes poverty wages. His daughter got into UCLA on a full scholarship, the first person in their family to go to college, and he couldn't send her because of a bank collapse that wasn't his fault. So I stopped singing for 7 minutes. I'd do it again. Dean." Peterson never responded to the letter, but he didn't fire Robert, and he didn't cancel Dean's contract. 3 weeks later, Dean was backstage before his Saturday night show when there was a knock on his dressing room door. It was Robert Hayes. He was wearing a suit Dean had never seen before. With him was a young woman in a yellow dress. "Mr. Martin," said Robert, "this is my daughter, Michelle. She wanted to meet you before she leaves for UCLA tomorrow." Dean stood up, shook Michelle's hand. "Your father tells me you're going to be a doctor." "I'm going to try, pre-med, if I can handle it." "You'll handle it. Your father didn't raise someone who gives up." Michelle was crying. "Thank you, Mr. Martin. You changed my life." "Your father changed your life," Dean corrected gently. "He worked for 11 years to give you this chance. I just helped with the last little bit." He turned to Robert. "You raised a brilliant daughter. That's harder than anything I've ever done." Robert shook Dean's hand. "I'll pay you back. It might take a while, but I'll pay you back every cent." "No," Dean said firmly. "It wasn't a loan. It was a gift. You don't pay back gifts." "Mr. Martin." "Robert, listen to me. I got lucky in life. I can sing, people like it, and they pay me ridiculous amounts of money to do it. You work harder than I ever have. You raised 3 kids alone. You kept a promise to your wife. You deserve this." He smiled. "Besides, someday Michelle is going to be a doctor. She's going to save lives. That's my investment. I'm investing in the future." Michelle Hayes graduated from UCLA in 1973 with a degree in biology. She went to medical school at UC San Francisco. She became a pediatric oncologist. For 35 years, she worked at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. She specialized in treating childhood leukemia, the same disease that had killed her mother. She never charged families who couldn't afford treatment. She set up a foundation that paid medical expenses for low-income families dealing with childhood cancer. The foundation was called the Dorothy Hayes Foundation, named for her mother, but everyone who worked there knew the real inspiration. A night in 1969 when Dean Martin stopped singing to ask a crying janitor what was wrong. Robert Hayes worked at the Riviera for another 12 years. He retired in 1981 at age 74. He lived to see all 3 of his children graduate from college. He lived to see Michelle become a doctor. He lived to see his 8 grandchildren. When he died in 1989, at age 82, his obituary mentioned that he'd worked as a janitor at the Riviera Hotel for 23 years. It also mentioned that Dean Martin had once stopped a concert to help him, and that act of kindness had changed his family's trajectory forever. Dean never talked about it publicly. When reporters asked him about the incident years later, he'd shrug. Guy needed help. I had money. Simple math. But people who were there that night never forgot. Frank Sinatra told the story for years. "That's Dean," Frank would say. "Everyone thinks I'm the one who makes the big gestures, the big speeches, but Dean just sees people. And when he sees someone hurting, he helps. No speeches, no press conferences, just help." In 1987, 2 years before he died, Robert Hayes was interviewed for a documentary about Las Vegas workers. The interviewer asked, "What was the most memorable moment of your 23 years working at the Riviera?" Robert didn't hesitate. June 14, 1969, Dean Martin stopped his concert because he saw me crying. He didn't have to do that. I was nobody, just a janitor. But he saw me, really saw me. His voice broke. He asked me what was wrong. He listened. He cared. And then he gave my daughter a future. Did you ever pay him back? I tried. For years I tried. I'd send money to his agent, $20 here, $50 there. Every time it got sent back with a note, not a loan, gift. Stop trying to pay it back. Robert smiled. So I paid it forward instead. Every time I had a little extra money, I'd help someone else, someone who needed it. Because that's what Dean taught me. You don't help people because you'll get paid back. You help people because they need help. What would you say to Dean Martin if you could say anything? Robert thought about it for a long moment. I'd say, "Thank you for seeing me, for seeing that a janitor is also a father, that someone in the shadows matters as much as someone in the spotlight. Thank you for stopping the show. Thank you for caring." He wiped his eyes. And I'd tell him that my daughter saved 847 children from leukemia during her career. 847 kids who lived because she became a doctor, because he gave her that chance. The lesson isn't complicated. Dean Martin stopped singing because he saw someone hurting. He didn't calculate the cost. He didn't worry about bad publicity. He didn't think about the inconvenience to the audience. He saw a person who needed help, and he helped. That's not celebrity charity. That's not a tax write-off. That's not good PR. That's just seeing people, really seeing them. The wealthy ones, the famous ones, the invisible ones. And understanding that everyone matters. Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves to be seen. Dean Martin taught us that the show can wait, the applause can wait, the money can wait, but people who are hurting can't wait. When you see someone in pain, you stop. You ask what's wrong. You listen. And if you can help, you help. Not because they'll pay you back, not because people will think you're a hero, but because that's what decent humans do for each other. The lights were bright on that stage in 1969, but Dean Martin walked past all of them to reach the shadows where Robert Hayes was crying, because that's where he was needed. And that's where real stars shine brightest.